Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to your final mini lesson of English 12B. Today we're going to be discussing modern and contemporary literature from 1901 to the present. Hope everyone's doing well, and be sure to reach out with any questions after you view this mini lesson. Let's get underway. Responding to the devastation of two world wars and the loss of the once powerful British Empire, British writers struggled to carve out a role for themselves in their new and different world. The old order had been shattered, and the familiar culture was dead. Out of the ashes, however, rose a new literature, exciting, experimental, and speaking with accents from every corner of the globe. At the turn of the 20th century, Great Britain was a nation at its peak, a peak it was about to topple from. Under the opulent reign of Victoria's successor, Edward VII, England was a land of prosperity, stability, and world dominance. Of course, no one could have known what the next 100 years would bring. The horrors of World War I, trench warfare, the German bombing raids that would devastate British cities during World War II, and the end of the once massive British Empire. It all began with a single gunshot. In 1914, a Serbian nationalist assassinated Archduke Francis Ferdinand, heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary. Austria declared war on Serbia, and like a chain of dominoes, alliances fell into place. Austria and Germany on one side, Russia, France, and Britain on the other. Both sides dug in, locked together in bloody trench warfare. A chaos of mud, barbed wire, exploding shells and hand grenades, machine guns, tanks, and poison gas. The Great War, as World War I was then known, dragged on, devastating Europe, killing or wounding virtually an entire generation of young men, and bringing a profound sense of disillusionment to the people. Siegfried Sassoon, a poet and soldier, had this to say: "I have seen and endured the suffering of the troops, and I can no longer be a party to prolong these sufferings." In 1917, the United States entered the war, leading to Germany's capitulation the following year into an uneasy peace. The war was finally over, but Europe now faced the consequences of 4 years of non-stop destruction. Britain had lost 750,000 men, and more than twice as many had been wounded, returning troops, men, and more than twice that amount. Returning troops promised a land fit for heroes, instead came home to an unemployment and economic depression. France was in shambles. Germany was crushed by the punishing terms of the treaty it signed at Versailles. Russia was hard hit as well, rocked not just by war but also by a revolution. In 1917, in which the Tsar was overthrown and replaced by a communist state. Anxious to rebuild, war-torn European nations turned to the United States for loans. Then came the U.S. stock market crash of 1929, cutting off the flow of funds and causing a worldwide depression. Anger, fear, and uncertainty took hold, but in the chaos, dictators seized power. In Italy, Benito Mussolini; in Russia, Joseph Stalin; in Germany, the Nazi leader Adolf Hitler. At first, Britain stood back as Hitler forcibly annexed Austria and marched into Czechoslovakia. Finally, in 1939, when Hitler invaded Poland, Britain and France declared war on Germany, Italy, and Japan soon allied themselves with Hitler, and World War II had begun. Terrible as the Great War had been for most British citizens, it was a distant tragedy played out on foreign battlefields. World War II was different. After the fall of France in 1940, German fighter planes crossed the English Channel and attacked Britain. As bombs rained down on London, the entire population mobilized to defend the home front. For 1 whole year, Britain held out alone against the Nazis. Then in 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union, and Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, bringing the United States into the war. Hitler was finally defeated in 1945. After the war, Britain was financially drained, burdened by debt and the need to rebuild its cities. Everything from butter to socks was rationed. Determined to provide at least the basic necessities, the new Labour government transformed Britain with a new national healthcare system and public education. Liberal in outlook and concerned with pressing domestic issues, Labour leaders had little desire to cling to far-flung colonies eager for self-rule. Instead, they gave India its independence in 1947, continuing a trend begun in the 1920s of dissolving the British Empire into a loose commonwealth of independent nations. When the British ruled much of the world, they had been famous for their provincialism, marching off into sweltering jungles, for example, wearing formal dress more suited to a London drawing room. Ironically, as Britain let go of its colonies, it became a great deal more international. One reason was the influx of immigrants from former British holdings into the West Indies, Africa, and India. Another was the increasing power of the United States, whose policies Britain generally acceded to and whose culture had an overwhelming influence. Britain's relationship with the rest of Europe changed as well, as the island nation forged strong links with its neighbors on the continent. In 1973, Great Britain entered the European Economic Community, and in 1992, the European Union. In 1994, it opened the Channel, a railway tunnel running underneath the English Channel connecting Britain to France. One issue that bedeviled Britain all through this period was that of independence for Ireland. The Irish had never accepted English rule and were faced with a dilemma when Great Britain entered World War I. Should they fight to defend an empire they hated? Many Irish did fight for that empire, but others took the opportunity to rise up against England in a bid for independence known as the Easter Rising of 1916. Although planned to be a nationwide rebellion, a series of mishaps led it to be confined to Dublin, with only about 1,700 men taking part. In fact, at that time, only a small portion of the British response whipped up support. In fact, at the time, only a small portion of the Irish public had supported the rebellion, yet the extreme harshness of British response whipped up support for the Irish nationalist cause, represented by the political parties Sinn Féin and the Irish Republican Army. In 1921, after a long struggle, the British split Ireland into two self-governing dominions, the Irish Free State, later renamed the Republic of Ireland, and Northern Ireland. Independence for all, but Northern Ireland was achieved in 1949. Reunification had never been achieved, nor has lasting peace for Northern Ireland. At first, sporadic, ongoing outbursts of violence between Protestant and Catholic factions in Northern Ireland escalated through the years until the 1990s, when paramilitary groups ordered a ceasefire. However, the peace process has been slow-moving, and tensions continue today. The Irish were not alone in their nationalist fervor. Throughout Europe and the European colonial empires, nationalism was the dominating spirit of the 20th century. This nationalism took many forms, from the peaceful demands of activist Mahatma Gandhi, leader of India's independence movement, to the murderous ambitions of Hitler, who killed 11 million racial undesirables, including 6 million Jews, in a quest to purify Germany. The English themselves were fiercely patriotic, yet perceptive writers began to see the ugly side of their own country's nationalism in such affairs as the Boer War, in which two independent South African republics were absorbed into the British Empire, mainly in order to acquire the areas of newfound gold. After World War I, Britain's grasp on its empire began to loosen as the spirit of nationalism increased in its far-flung holdings across the world. In turn, Britain granted ever greater degrees of self-determination to its subject lands. In 1926, British political leaders convened a conference in which Canada, South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand were made members of the British Commonwealth of Nations. In other words, these countries were now partners, not possessions, of Britain. In the decades after World War II, Britain yielded to nationalistic and economic pressures and relinquished control of most of its remaining colonies in Asia, Africa, and the West Indies. The last trace of the empire disappeared in 1997 when Hong Kong, which had been a British colony for 155 years, was returned to Chinese control. Things fall apart, and the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. These apocalyptic lines, written by poet William Butler Yeats in 1919, perfectly captured the uncertainty of the early 20th century. The old empires of Turkey and Austria-Hungary had fallen to pieces. Russia was in upheaval, Germany crushed, In England, a stable social order based on rigid class distinctions was giving way, and as cities continued to swell, London's population reached 5 million by 1910. A sense of community disappeared, replaced by the rootlessness and anonymity of urban life. In the arts, modernism was a way of trying to make sense of this new fragmented world. Before, the artist's task had been to represent a recognizable shared reality. Painters created portraits and landscapes. Novelists took their heroes and villains through stories that had a beginning, a middle, and a satisfying end. These traditional forms, however, seemed inadequate as a response to modern life. A new kind of art was needed, one that would reject old versions of reality, creating its own values rather than relying on any common assumptions, and somehow connect the disjointed pieces of human experience into a coherent, yet not false or artificial whole. This was a daunting task, but British writers were inspired by the bold innovations of modern artists such as Henri Matisse and Pablo Picasso, and of composers such as Igor Stravinsky. Writers, however, faced unique challenges. Musicians still had notes and painters still had line and color, but the basic materials of the narrative, character, and plot were being called into question. During the 1920s, the works of psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud first appeared in English, published by novelist Virginia Woolf and her husband Leonard. Freud showed that character could not be easily understood. People were complex, inconsistent, and unpredictable, driven by irrational urges that might be hidden even from themselves. Writers' past assumptions about plot, that events should move into a straight line from here to there, were also being rethought. The French philosopher and writer Henri Bergson, for example, argued that time was like a stream in which past, present, and future all flowed together continuously. Under the influence of these ideas, writers such as James Joyce and Virginia Woolf experimented with stream of consciousness, a technique in which the reader is inside the character's mind, hearing his or her thoughts just as they occur in an apparently jumbled and random order. Because memories of the past, impressions of the present, and the hopes and fears for the future are all mixed together in the character's consciousness, there is no need to follow the character through a series of important events. Any ordinary day will do, and in fact, both Joyce and Woolf wrote novels taking place entirely in a single day. This approach, emphasizing depth rather than breadth, calling for a subtly perceptive use of detail and symbolism, led many writers to a fresh interest in the short story. No longer able to assume that readers shared a common set of values, writers as diverse as Woolf, Catherine Mansfield, and D.H. Lawrence shifted concern to the human being in isolation, to human relationships, and to common human strengths and vulnerabilities. Yet the modernists did not all think or write alike. While they struggled with the same problems, they arrived at different solutions. What they shared mainly was a sense of alienation from their own society. Many lived as expatriates, and especially for many readers and critics, whose reactions to their work ranged from bewilderment to fury. As a result, their audience was limited at first to an elite minority known as the avant-garde. For example, T.S. Eliot's poetic masterpiece, The Waste Land, was first published in a tiny magazine with a circulation of only 600. It's no wonder that the work of modernist poets such as Eliot and Yeats took time to catch on. They were writing an entirely new kind of poetry, intellectually challenging, ironic, and often disquieting. At the center of the avant-garde was a circle of friends known as the Bloomsbury Group, which met at the homes of Virginia Woolf and her sister, the artist Vanessa Bell. The group included, among others, the novelist E.M. Forster, the art critic Roger Fry, and the economist John Maynard Keynes. Though novelist D.H. Lawrence ridiculed them as self-satisfied black beetles bustling around their small circle, the Bloomsbury Group was in fact quite influential, and we're going to read a lot of their work over the next few weeks. Be sure to turn on those Cornell notes, ladies and gentlemen. That's all I have for you. Enjoy your contemporary and modern literature from Great Britain.